Hi, hello. A very good afternoon to everyone. We present to you RAD's consulting team, and we are the official consultant to Gidget Company, which is a global manufacturer. And I'm Rishabh, and here's my team: Arnav, Daniel, Sai, and Arthur. And we are here to present case analysis on whether our client should keep the Chinese plant open or they should shut it down in the wake of coronavirus epidemic. And considering all the exchange rate and demand scenarios, considering all the exchange rate and demand scenarios, and keeping in mind all the macroeconomic and geostrategic factors, and based on our quantitative analysis, we feel that if we decide to shut down the Chinese plant, we're going to incur a loss of $30 million against a profit of $44 million if we keep the Chinese plant open. And in addition to that, based on our earlier experience, we see that Chinese market has been resilient and they bounce back very early. So sustaining a Chinese presence and keeping a long-term strategic relationship with the Chinese supply base is very important for companies' long-term overarching goals. Now I'm going to hand it over to Arnav, who's going to talk about assumption and going to take it forward.
Thank you, Rishabh. So as Rishabh mentioned, we came up with our recommendation after doing an analysis. For this, we had certain assumptions that we made. The first assumption was that the transport cost between the importing and exporting nation, because we have 4 locations manufacturing the product, is going to be divided equally between the importing and exporting nation. And the duties are obviously going to be paid by the importing nation. This was done so that we can understand, every location's profitability and understand, where to make the goods flow from based on the scenario that we are in. I'm going to be covering the scenarios that we looked at in the next slide. Another thing that we assumed was that since coronavirus is not, similar to what we've seen with other viruses that China has seen, like the swine flu or the SARS virus. And I think the industry also feels that it's something more. What we have assumed is that, it's going to take China a year to, completely bounce back and start production, which is why we've taken year 0 calculations and year 1 to 4 calculations. And from first year onwards, the demand in China is going to be increasing by 25% every year. And demand for other locations in our analysis is assumed to be the same during this time period. Now, as we mentioned, we looked at different scenarios. We analyzed a total of 12 scenarios in the second round because we had there were 2 scenarios, to keep China open or to shut down the plant. In that, now we had 2 different exchange rates and 3 demand scenarios, which led to a total of 12 scenarios. As I mentioned, we did a calculation from year 0 and then from year 1 to 4, based on first year China being closed because it'll take them a year to bounce back, and then from year 1 to year 4. In terms of flow of goods, as I had mentioned earlier, since we have 2 different exchange rate scenarios, if what we found out was that if we were in exchange rate 1 scenario, every country satisfies its own demand, and the excess demand over the capacity is to be satisfied by China. And in case we land in exchange rate scenario 2, US in both the scenarios is satisfying its own demand, but in exchange rate 2, China supplies to Mexico and Turkey and Mexico don't produce a whole lot. That's because the exchange rate goes really high and then it can come to losses. So these are the things that we looked at when we decided the flow based on the scenario that we were in. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to talk about closing the China plant.
Thank you, Arnav. So we analyzed this on pros and cons to begin with. And to be honest, we didn't see a lot of pros to this plan. But the ones we did see were that, of course, if you close a plant, you have lower total fixed costs. Now, as we heard earlier today through our speakers, we will still have to pay, because of Chinese labor laws, we will still have to pay the Chinese workers that are on salary during their contracts, so we will still be incurring some cost there. Now, we will also see a less complex supply chain with one less manufacturing site, but the most important pro is that we're going to mitigate the health risk to our employees by having them not work in this factory. Now, to the cons, from a financial standpoint, it makes more sense to, if we close down the Chinese factory, to not bring in supply from other locations. It is way more expensive, so we will have to shut down the entire China market. This will sour our trade relations and make it harder for us to get back into China in the future should the situation change. And this gives us a high opportunity cost as well. Now, in our supply chain, we will now have no excess capacity. We'll be operating very close to capacity because with the information we were given in the case, we are not able to make a full recommendation of a new plant location because we don't have anything on GIGCO's financial positions or their capacity or their capabilities to create a new plant. So we're keeping it at the capacity it is currently. Now, moving on to the actual spreadsheet, this is a summary of our findings. So we had the 6 scenarios that Arnav mentioned, which are exchange rate 1 and exchange rate 2, demand situations 1, 2, and 3. We did a profit and loss for each scenario, and since each scenario has the same probability, we use that as our weights, and we got a risk-adjusted P&L that comes to that total of almost $30 million of loss over the 5 years we projected, which Arnav mentioned, or which Rashad mentioned. I'm now going to pass it to Sai, who will talk about our other scenario.
Thank you, Dan. So obviously, this $30 million is a big risk, but don't worry, keep calm. We have RADS Consulting to help you. So what we suggest is we keep the China plant open, and talking about the pros and cons, as Dan did for if we keep the Chinese plant closed. Looking at the pros, if we keep the plant open, first and foremost, if we have the first exchange rate, we'll only be importing in the US, so we'll eliminate the transportation costs, the duties, and other factors which add to our costs. And second is obviously, as we all know, in supply chain, demand planning is never accurate. So we have the flexibility if we keep the Chinese plant open. So we can support those markets where there's an unforeseen increase in the demand. And moving on to the con side, we have the usual cons, that is duties and transportation costs, total fixed costs if we keep this plant open. But the big concern would be the effects of coronavirus, which can last longer than anticipated. As Arnav mentioned before, we are just considering year 0 where the virus will last, but it could last well into the next year as well. Now, this is another financial calculation which we did if we keep the Chinese plant open. We have similar scenarios as Dan discussed before. And looking at the final costs, our risk-adjusted profit comes to around $44 million, which includes the fixed cost of keeping the Chinese market open, and also the sales which we would recover from the Chinese market. Now I'll hand it over to Arthur, who will talk about the risk factors and give the final recommendations.
Thank you, Sai. So given our proposal to keep all 4 of our global plants open, we decided to use both forward market and money market strategies to hedge against the fluctuations in exchange rate risk, which is inevitable in this scenario. So for the exchange rate scenario number 2, we noticed that the Turkish lira actually strengthened from 5.7 to 2.3, which made it prohibitively expensive to not only manufacture, but also to export from Turkey. So by going with this strategy, we could mitigate this sort of risk. There are also tax benefits of multinational production, clearly tariffs being one of them, but also potential royalty agreements between the foreign plants and the parent company. If we set up our organization to have subsidiaries, so our foreign plants are the subsidiaries, they can deduct the royalty payments that they're paying us from the taxes that they owe within that foreign company, which will result in savings. On that note, there's also potential for corporate inversion. Our base is here in the United States, but in the future, we can decide to pick either one of these 3 countries as our home tax base, and take advantage of their local tax laws. Of course, multinational production strategy is better suited to overcome trade barriers, as we discussed, tariffs, quotas, subsidies, and also foreign currency manipulation, and supply chain risk disruptions. By having multiple sources, multiple countries of source, we can avoid disruptions that come from natural disasters, political risks, and also economical disruptions. And finally, a multinational production strategy is better suited to adapt to local tastes and cultures. We want to build our relationship in China. This is something that we've been doing continuously, and we want to make sure this continues on in the future. And pulling out in the time of crisis wouldn't be the best move, in our opinion. So moving on to the recommendation, we believe the company should keep the China plant open alongside the other 3 plants. This will result in the highest expected return possible of $444 million projected over the course of the next 4 years. And this makes sense because the demand can be met with greater profitability and flexibility. Okay. So this is why we decided to keep all 4 plants open. Thank you, and we're going to open up the board now for any questions.
So, in your analysis, then, I think you showed it, but please clarify. You're saying keep everything open, but even if China is closed for quite some time, you're still going to make a profit?
So, yeah. We are projecting the strategy assuming that China's demand is going to come back. This strategy will change as we learn more about the virus. This is not something that we know right off the bat right now, but we took the information we were given and projected it for 5 years, assuming that it would come back after year 1. If we get to that point and the trend is continuing, that the virus has gotten worse, it hasn't gotten under control, then we need further analysis. This isn't just a set plan that's going to fix something that's ongoing right now.
To add to that, there were 2 assumptions. Assumption 1 was that the demand will start coming up slowly, but production capacity can be started from year 1 itself.
So there are 100,000 units that China is supplying to the United States. Is that still possible in the current scenario, or what is your plan if that doesn't come through, if China can no longer supply it?
So, yeah. I mean, I can answer it, but.
Yeah, in this scenario wherein initially we anticipate that the plant would be closed, so it won't be able to supply the excess demand of the US market, but we anticipate that the other plants would support the US market as well. So it will just be wherein the demand is equal to the supply. But let's say if the US market, if there's a sudden fluctuation, then we obviously would need the Chinese market to, Chinese plant to support the other markets as well.
So to add to that, we would ship from Mexico, because Mexico has capacity for 150,000 units, whereas at the most in their domestic production, or their domestic consumption, they'll only use 50,000. The duties are lower there, and the transportation is lower than shipping from Turkey. So if China's out, now China's the cheapest alternative, but then it'll go to Mexico. And then if Mexico gets, we wouldn't have it in a scenario where Mexico wouldn't be able to supply it, but if that did happen, we would move to Turkey for our last push.
And as I mentioned, because of the assumptions, we are assuming that the demand in all the other locations are same over the 3 scenarios that we looked at. And in every scenario, not counting China, we are at capacity. So assuming that, we would be able to fulfill the demand.
Yep. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.